Welcome to the Language of Evidence. I'm your host, Alex Morozov. And I think this is the only time I will be by myself. In the future, we will have guests. And if any of you want to be a guest, please let me know. You can reach me at alex.morozov@evivapartners.org. This episode is unusual. I will be releasing the video, part 1, of a very important event that occurred in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, February 13th. I got invited to it through pure serendipity. It was a press launch of the MAHA Alliance with Senator Ron Johnson, then CEO Del Bigtree, and then Q&A. We will go over what MAHA is. It stands for Make America Healthy Again. Senator Ron Johnson called it an enormous and growing movement. I should also mention that if you think this is only about vaccines, you are mistaken. It's about all of science and medicine. And if you think that it's a US only issue, you're also mistaken. This is a global issue. The majority of clinical research is global. The majority of journal articles are global. Plus, they mentioned that they're setting up an organization called MAHA Worldwide. So even if you don't live in the US, I recommend that you listen. And incidentally, this podcast is available in 3 forms. Video, if you can watch. Audio, if you prefer, which will have all the necessary information, and I will try to describe things for the visually impaired. And vice versa. In the video, you'll be able to see the text. It helps me read, and it also helps someone who is hard of hearing. And the third form is just a plain transcript with links, so you can read it at your own leisure. And one more housekeeping item. Please subscribe, like, post, forward. I'm putting this on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And one more thing. This podcast will be a little long, maybe 2 hours, and probably that's just for part 1. But then again, I heard Joe Rogan's and Lex Friedman's can be even longer, 3-4 hours. And so you don't have to listen to it all at once. I like long podcasts. So back to the press conference. Leading media outlets were in the room. I also asked a couple of questions. I'll save that for part 2. I'm not sure why it has not been released or described by anyone. It's Sunday evening, actually Monday morning, February 17th now when I'm recording this. This event took place on the 13th. MAHA itself has not described it or put it on the website, maha.io, or the media. So I thought I would release it myself. It's too important. Del Bigtree is a longtime friend of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And with Senator Ron Johnson's presence, Kaylee Means also made an appearance. And he was the one who apparently brokered the alliance between Trump and RFK Jr. It's clear that this organization is the extra government extension of RFK Jr. The things the government cannot do, like setting up media outlets, this organization will likely do. It's also important because I consider this press conference the first indication of what we're experiencing with the appointment of RFK Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services. What I am calling a revolt against science, medicine, and the media. Many people will die. In fact, I'm launching a movement called #MAHA Kills, opposing the revolt against science, medicine, and the media. If you want to join, again, please reach out, alex.morozov@evivapartners.org. You can do so confidentially if you're afraid of being fired, as most people are. And I will not disclose your name. And incidentally, if you have any tips or confidential information, you can send them to me via anonymized email, such as Proton. In fact, people already started to send me those. This is a difficult time in our country, with massive layoffs in the government, uncertainty, gag orders. So this created an eerie silence, which many people I spoke to acknowledge. Academics, government, professional associations, industry, everyone is either completely quiet or treading lightly. Given this, I decided to jump into the void. A bit about myself. I'm a Russian Jew. I make a very good borscht. I was born in Russia and came to the US when I was 18 to go to college. I graduated from MIT with a degree in biology. Got a combined MD PhD from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where Chuck Schumer was my commencement speaker. Trained in internal medicine at Columbia and then medical oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. And during my oncology fellowship, I got interested in drug development. Memorial Sloan Kettering was a clinical trial powerhouse. Large proportion of our patients were on clinical trials. And I remember as a first-year fellow, I spent a year in the pancreas clinic. When I started, I got to know the patients very well. They were coming in frequently for chemotherapy. And then a few months later, I looked around the waiting room and I realized that I didn't know any of the people. That's how aggressive this disease was. And it still is, unfortunately. So I decided to go to the pharmaceutical industry because that's where new drugs are developed. This was 15 years ago, and I got to oversee over 200 clinical trials and helped with a dozen different regulatory approvals globally. I got to work not just with the FDA, but with health authorities around the world. I also got interested in technology and led digital innovation teams. And then 2 years ago, I lost my job, and it took me a few months to find another one. In the meantime, I decided to write a book about what I do and answer one basic question I had. How come the term evidence-based medicine was only coined in 1991? I recently came up with a title for the book, The Language of Evidence. I'm so excited, by the way, that I recently got to work with Gordon Guyatt at McMaster University, who was the one who actually coined the term evidence-based medicine. He's one of the most cited scientists alive and is an incredible person. I'm quoting him in my expose called Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Andrew Wakefield, and the Manufacture of Evidence, which is posted on evivapartners.org. It's not the topic of today's podcast, but please check it out. And huge thanks for Cheryl Stolberg from the Times for referring to it in her Wednesday article. Unfortunately, this came too late, and RFK Jr. was still confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services. But I digress. That's not the topic of today. So for my book, I wanted to understand, what did people do before 1991? How did people know what works and what doesn't? And when was the first clinical trial? And what is indigenous medicine? How do people think about evidence there? Covering dark chapters of human experimentation, the birth of evidence-based medicine, value in healthcare, and then the future, real-world evidence, patient digital twins, AI, etc. I have an agent now at Janklov and Nesbitt. She's amazing. I'm trying to finish this book as quickly as I possibly can. In the process, I realized that even though I spent 15 years generating medical evidence, I didn't know what the word actually means. And in fact, I'm not alone. We tried to do a survey asking people, how often do you discuss evidence with your doctor? Couldn't do the survey because many people said, I don't know what that means. They think evidence is something that is from law and order, how you prove that somebody's guilty. So a few months ago, I left pharma and started a nonprofit called Aviva Partners with a simple mission to promote better understanding of evidence and a simple premise that a lot of our problems in healthcare, rising costs, poor and unequal outcomes, are due to not understanding how evidence works. Patients not understanding why they're being asked to do certain things, doctors not having the time or not knowing how to explain it to patients. So we have big plans to address this that you can see on our website. So needless to say, a couple of weeks ago, I was glued to the screen during RFK Jr.'s Senate confirmation hearings. Towards the end, he mentioned a paper that just came out the week before that, again, attempts to show that vaccines cause autism. And I thought, how strange that it just came out the week before. What a coincidence. I started looking into this and ultimately had lunch with Anthony Mawson, the author of this paper. All of this is described in this white paper on avivapartners.org. Again, that's not the topic of today. But this experience made me realize that I personally can make a difference in the current events because of my unique situation. Number one, I'm a technical expert, although not specifically on vaccines. There are much better experts out there, but they're afraid to speak. Number two, I'm self-employed. I can speak my mind. And number three, I've been thinking for 2 years about how to explain complex topics around medical evidence. So this makes me a perfect spokesperson. And that also led me to this idea of starting the hashtag MAHA Kills movement, opposing the revolt against science, medicine, and the media. And even in this part one, where we will only go over the first 25 minutes of the press conference, you will see exactly what I mean. So more on this later. And again, if you want to learn more, please reach out alex.morzov@avivapartners.org. So then on Wednesday, I saw that Kennedy's final vote was scheduled for Thursday. I jumped on the train, went to DC, so I could sit in the gallery of the Senate to watch this historic vote in person. There were very few people in the gallery, basically just one group of people and me. As luck would have it, it was the MAHA Alliance team, including Del Bigtree. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I could tell among the group he was the boss. And while we were sitting and waiting for the session to start, we chatted with some of the group members. And I heard that they have a press conference later that day at 4 p.m. And I said, can I join? And they said, of course. They told me where it was going to be. So at 4 p.m., I showed up. Before they started, there was Del Bigtree talking to Senator Ron Johnson, their big supporter. More on this later. So before we jump into the video, I want to mention again that this press conference was a turning point for me. I got really scared. And that's where the idea of a revolt against science, medicine, and the media popped into my head. So let's begin.
Thank you all for coming here. I was in the Oval Office about an hour or so ago and watched Neil Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch, with President Trump present, swear Bobby Kennedy in as the new Secretary of Health and Human Services. I believe, I'm hoping this is a watershed moment for America. I described in Bobby's hearing that I remember when he called me and said that he was thinking about joining forces with President Trump. He was asking me whether he thought he could be confirmed. And the first words out of my mouth were literally, Bobby, this is an answer to my prayers. I'd gotten to know Bobby during COVID. We were trying to convey the same truths to the American public. I understand the price that Bobby Kennedy has paid fighting for children's health, fighting to get the truth out, fighting to expose the corporate capture of our federal agencies. I know the political and personal price he was going to pay for making the decision to join the forces with President Trump, but I couldn't be more happy that he did so. It's important not only because by President Trump and Bobby Kennedy putting their differences aside and focusing on an area of agreement to solve a problem, it not only demonstrates exactly how you solve a problem. Let's face it, I don't agree with anybody 100%. So if I'm going to solve a problem, I'm going to set aside differences and focus on that. But I think even more important, it demonstrated to America what we are going to need to do politically to heal and unify a horribly divided nation. So to me, this is a moment of true hope. One thing I found out in all of my recent activity, whether it's working with doctors, looking at COVID and the vaccine injured, and those events I held, the event I held with Bobby Kennedy and Dr. Casey Means, her brother Callie, and all those nutritionists, is this MAHA movement. There is absolutely nothing partisan about it.
Okay, so let's stop here for a second. There are a few things here to unpack. First of all, who are Casey and Kaylee Means, you might wonder. And I refer you to a stat piece from October 7, 2024, that's called, "With boost from RFK Jr. and Tucker Carlson, two chronic disease entrepreneurs vault into Trump's orbit. Kaylee and Casey Means push anti-corporate message to make America healthy again." And also, I highly recommend the roundtable, which was done by the Free Press and Barry Weiss on January 28th, called MAHA, the Coalition of Nutritionists, Shamans, and Moms. There's a video and text that goes along with it. Very, very informative. And Kaylee Means was there, one of the three people, panelists. And then Senator Ron Johnson also mentions this roundtable. So what was that? That was an event in the Senate office building on September 23rd, 2024. And the video of that event is available on CHD TV. So CHD is the Children's Health Defense. That's Kennedy's anti-vax organization. And that has its own online video repository that they call CHD TV. I include the link if any of you want to watch. This is what it sort of looked like as it was kicking off. There's Senator Johnson, Mr. Kennedy, Casey Means on the left, Kaylee Means on the right, and further to the left is Dr. Marty Makary, who's nominated as the head of FDA, and more on him in future podcasts. I'm not sure if Del Bigtree is there. I imagined he must have been. And if you watch the video, you'll see Senator Johnson says, I particularly want to thank all the participants. These are men and women who tirelessly fought to provide the public with the type of information, the type of truth that the American public needs to hear. And many of them bear the scars for simply trying to tell the truth. He goes on to say that in 2022, he held a similar meeting about COVID-19, also called a second opinion, in the same building. He says it was about the pandemic that was used to frighten and control the public on a global scale. And then he also talks about the corruption and capture of government agencies, the media, medical journals, and the medical establishment by large corporate interests. Very serious. And incidentally, RFK Jr. has a very, very similar quote in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci. And so Senator Johnson continues, this event is to ask questions we have not been allowed to ask. Foundation for changes that have occurred over the last century, sanitation, agriculture, food processing, healthcare industries, and suggestions to put us on a better path. The status of our health is not good, despite huge spending. Those who question the orthodoxy are ridiculed, vilified, and canceled with concerted efforts made to destroy their reputations and careers. Remember, this is September 2024. RFK Jr. just joined Trump's campaign a month earlier. So he continues, we saw this during the pandemic when doctors who had the courage and compassion to treat COVID patients with cheap generic drugs were fired, it means ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, were fired, sued, lost certifications. This intimidation works, and most doctors remain silent. So that's September. Now, we're in February, and you can imagine the excitement the other day, February 13th, historic day. Finally, these people who were intimidated, ridiculed, vilified, now have a supporter in the administration and are able to speak freely. So let's see, what is this truth that they couldn't say before? Let's go back.
I know Bobby in that one event said, I used to be a super villain to him, the way I was portrayed in the media. But it's amazing when you actually get to know somebody, up close and personal. those differences just melt when you focus on something so important as what is driving chronic illness. You know, what has caused this incredible upsurge in autism? President Trump was speaking about that.
Okay. We'll go a little bit more.
It was actually a 1970 study. It's very, very hard to conduct this study, but they're trying to get some sense of, you know, what is the rate of autism, and that study reveals about 1 in 10,000. That's back in 1970. You know, fast forward to today, something like 1 in 36, 1 in 34. I hear different numbers. California's 1 in 22. You know, anybody you know is a family with an autistic child, you know, particularly a severely autistic child. I mean, this is a tragedy. These are tragedies that have to be prevented. We need to understand what's driving, what are the root causes of chronic illness, what's the root causes of chronic illness. We can't be afraid to ask those questions.
Okay. Again, a lot here. Is that true? That there's an epidemic of autism? Let's take a look at this. This is a piece in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, from 2023. It's called Autism Prevalence Has Been on the Rise in the US for Decades, and that's progress. It goes on to say, the CDC's biennial reports have revealed a steady uptick in autism prevalence among 8-year-old children, from an estimated 1 in 150 children in the year 2000 to 1 in 44 in 2018. By 2020, an estimated 1 in 36 children were identified with autism spectrum disorder, according to the most recent report. So that part is correct. It actually is 1 in 36. But what looks like an autism surge is attributable largely to external advances in the ability to understand and characterize the condition. Although researchers can't rule out that more children today than in the past develop signs of autism, there's constantly no good evidence to support this. Evidence of an epidemic of diagnosis, on the other hand, is plentiful. And it's not just diagnosis, it's also that even as recently as 2011, there was substantial stigma around the diagnosis. But today, with the efforts of groups like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, we're moving to a place where autistic people are really proud of who they are. So this may also contribute to an increase in awareness, and therefore people don't have to hide their diagnosis. The first description of autism as a condition was only in 1943. And since then, the professional's ability to identify autistic children has steadily improved, such as due to the initiatives like the CDC's Learn the Signs, Act Early campaign that launched in 2004, and the American Academy of Pediatrics 2006 recommendation that children receive screening specifically for autism starting at 18 months. And then they're quoting an expert who says, clinicians are getting better at spotting what was always there. Plus, decades ago, it didn't really help to make the diagnosis of autism. So professor here is quoted as saying, it used to be that if you had an autistic child, you would try and get a different diagnosis for that child because there were no services for autistic children. It wasn't until 1990 that Congress began including autism under what is now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. And not until the early 2000s that states started requiring private health insurers to cover autism services, such as behavioral interventions. The criteria for an autism diagnosis are also different today. The diagnosis evolved as researchers and clinicians better understood the similarities and differences across other conditions. Today, we have a much better understanding of what is and what isn't autism, says one expert. Therefore, we diagnose it more clearly. And so, in summary, there's really not good evidence that there's something else that would be changing over time in a way that would amount to an appreciable increase in prevalence. A mathematical modeling in 2011, for example, found that changes in several perinatal risk factors for autism, either alone or in different combinations, could account for less than 1% of the 57% increase in autism in the US from 2002 to 2006. So the other thing that Senator Johnson mentioned, is it true that we're afraid to ask those questions about the cause, the root cause? Well, here's a group from Ireland that wrote a whole review about this, and I'm going to include this link. A whole review, autism, it's a chapter in a textbook. Autism spectrum disorders, etiology and pathology. This was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. There are many researchers looking at this. And it's complex. Look at this, very complex. For some individuals, solely caused by the presence of genetic mutations. In most cases, the genetic setup of an individual will, in combination with the exposure to environmental factors, determine the risk of autism spectrum disorders. By the way, no mention of vaccines in this chapter. And then the last question that was posed by Senator Johnson is I'll just jump ahead here. Who are these American people that are so eager to understand the causes of autism and linkage to vaccines? Because it's not the autism community. The autism community does not support any further research on the role of vaccines. They've moved on. In fact, they issued this statement recently, a couple of weeks ago. National disability groups unite to protect lives and dispel vaccine myths in the autism community, Autism Society, and various other organizations. Reinforce science that vaccines are not linked to autism. National disability organizations offer a united front, reinforcing the science-based facts that the vaccines do not cause autism. Numerous large-scale studies involving millions of children worldwide have found no evidence to support any connection between vaccines, including the MMR vaccine, and autism. And you might say, well, maybe this doesn't represent all organizations. Okay, well, I could not find any autism patient advocacy organization that supports additional vaccine research. If anyone knows of such an organization, please let me know. Again, alex.morzov@avivapartners.org. Okay, Senator Johnson continues.
That's what's so unfortunate about this whole process leading up to this is people like Bobby Kennedy, they haven't even been allowed to ask the question without being ridiculed and vilified, and that has to stop. Because as I said in his hearing, the American people desperately want these answers on a completely nonpartisan basis. So, Bobby Kennedy is dedicated as the Secretary of Health and Human Services to what he describes as radical transparency. I'm the chairman of the permanent subcommittee investigation. I can tell you in my investigations, the federal government is opaque. They are so far from transparent, and that's a real problem. The government belongs to we the people. The information the government collects, the analysis it does on their safety surveillance systems, it's public information. It shouldn't be withheld. So I am pleased to introduce Del Bigtree from the High Wire, a man who has been engaged in radical transparency, paid the price. Now, I think you've probably been vilified, ridiculed every now and again. But this is about the truth. This is what the American people not only want, not only demand, but they completely deserve it. So I'm just happy to play a bit part here in this enormous and a growing movement of making America healthy again. And again, at the forefront of that for many, many years. I've learned so much from Del Bigtree. I think Americans have learned so much from Del Bigtree. So my hat's off to you. Thank you for all you've done, and welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, so who is Del Bigtree? One thing, and I'll come back to this later, he wrote the foreword to RFK Jr.'s 2023 book, Vax Unvax, Let the Science Speak. But also there's a nice article by NBC from January of last year. RFK Jr. hires top anti-vaccine activist as campaign communications director. Del Bigtree, who leads the country's second best-funded anti-vaccine organization, announced his new role in a letter rife with misinformation. Here he is. And I'll just mention a couple of things that I think I have it highlighted, but now I can't see it. That's okay. Bigtree is the executive director of the Informed Consent Action Network, the country's second best funded anti-vaccine organization after Children's Health Defense, which is Kennedy's. In addition, Bigtree hosts The High Wire, an anti-vaccine and conspiracism internet show. You can see him here, looking angry, pointing a finger as he is speaking at the podium outside somewhere at a rally in 2019. Announcing his new role, Bigtree released a letter rife with misinformation alleging that the COVID vaccines were responsible for widespread injury and death. Bigtree called for his supporters to stop the globalist New World Order and unite across the political spectrum under the banner of medical freedom. While Bigtree's title is new, his involvement with the Kennedy campaign is well established. He had appeared at official campaign events and fundraisers, and campaign finance records show the Kennedy campaign has paid nearly $90,000 in communication consulting to KFP Consulting, a Texas organization registered under Del Bigtree's name. Bigtree, a former daytime television producer, has been a prominent force behind the modern anti-vaccine movement. In 2016, he teamed up with the discredited physician and researcher Andrew Wakefield to produce Vaxxed, an anti-vaccine propaganda film that resurrected the long-debunked claim that the MMR vaccine causes autism and that the government covered it up. Big Tree promoted the film with a multi-state bus tour and became a celebrity within the movement. Over the next few years, he and his camera crew became a fixture at state capitals where he advocated for relaxing childhood vaccination requirements. Big Tree is also known for his media attention-grabbing stunts and incendiary speeches. In 2019, he was criticized for appearing at rallies wearing a yellow Star of David to suggest that activists who opposed childhood vaccines were akin to Jews in Nazi Germany during World War II. In a speech at a Washington, D.C. rally opposing COVID vaccination requirements in 2022, he invoked the Nuremberg trials in a promise to hold public officials and the media accountable for promoting COVID precautions and vaccinations. He actually does mention the Nuremberg Code. That will be in part 2 of this podcast. Okay.
Senator Ron Johnson's been a lone voice in the wilderness inside of government for many years, and we are eternally grateful for all the hearings and the things that he has done to bring awareness to the reality that is taking place today. It's very simple. This is a story that's been blown out of proportion. The misleading facts have been coming from mainstream press. The fact is this: vaccine injury is real. It happens. People are injured every single year. Children are maimed and killed every single year by our vaccine program. There are many that will say, well, it's rare. Does that mean we shouldn't talk about it? Do we talk about rare diseases? Do we try to cure rare diseases? Why is it in this one topic you are ridiculed, attacked, said that you're spreading misinformation for stating the obvious facts? My name is Del Bigtree. I am the CEO of MAHA Alliance, MAHA Worldwide, MAHA Action. But really, I'm just one representative of.
Okay. So let's take a look at this. MAHA Alliance, MAHA Worldwide, MAHA Action. Okay. So MAHA Worldwide doesn't have a website as far as I can tell, but it's the company to which RFK Jr. transferred the trademark from MAHA in January. So this is not for some reason not opening. Oh, here we go. The LLC managed by Big Tree received the trademark. Big Tree, former communications director for Kennedy's presidential campaign, is listed as a manager of MAHA Worldwide on trademark documents. Public records reveal little about MAHA Worldwide other than its Wyoming mailing address. Okay, so that's MAHA Worldwide. MAHA Action website is maha.io. That's the website that the MAHA team gave to me when we were sitting in the gallery. There's not much on that website.
Many, many incredible voices in a grassroots movement, a true grassroots movement for medical freedom that started many years ago and now has found real focus in this movement that we're now calling. I want to take just one moment to thank President Donald Trump, someone who is the first candidate that we ever saw dare to make the statement that vaccines cause autism.
Okay. President Trump, someone who was the first candidate we ever saw to dare make the statement that vaccines cause autism. And this, by the way, was his early presidential run, I think 20. Oh, it may have been the 2016 presidential run. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this whole saga of vaccines and autism and RFK Jr.'s role in that, there's an episode, excellent episode, on the podcast called Maintenance Phase from mid-2023, which is a perfect discussion of this topic. So Big Tree continues about Trump.
That he thought that they did, that he wanted to do investigations into vaccines. And I'm not talking about this last election, I'm talking about the very first one. And every time he was asked in different scenarios, or whether it was on a debate stage, he said, I have seen children run across my office that were healthy, went and got a vaccination, and suddenly we're having issues spelling and reading. We've heard the story over and over again. I'm one of those that has probably heard that story more than most, because I decided to do an investigation. I'm just like you, all of you in the room. I'm just a journalist, I'm just a reporter. No, I have no medical degree.
Yeah, here I made a note. I'm not going to fact check that, whether he's just like all the other reporters. This room is full of reporters from all the mainstream media, but somehow I don't think so, but he continues.
But I did work for over 6 years on a medical talk show called The Doctors, where every single week I read medical journals to find stories of breaking news and science. And I learned to understand how to read that science, as Robert Kennedy Jr. has said the very same thing about being a lawyer. When I think, where is this movement coming from? What is it? Seeing all the reporting, how far back do we go? Robert Kennedy Jr. began talking about this when he was first asked by parents that were coming up at his environmental hearings, where he was talking about mercury in the water, saying it's toxic, it's destroying health. And those mothers said, will you please look at the vaccines? There is mercury. The same thing you're fighting to get out of our water is being injected into our children. Of course, he was reticent because mainstream media and mainstream medicine scares everyone away from ever doing any investigation into that. But eventually a mother sat outside of his door with a stack of studies, and he couldn't ignore her. It's much like what happened to me. I was working on the Doctor's television show, and I was tipped off that there was a whistleblower in
so that story about mercury in vaccines, that is the thimerosal saga. I won't go into it. It has been discussed at length, including on the CDC website. And then he's going to talk about essentially the story of his documentary, Vaxxed, with this supposedly a whistleblower who never ended up blowing the whistle, William Thompson. And he partnered on that documentary with Andrew Wakefield. And then RFK Jr. also wrote a book, Vaccine Whistleblower, about this.
inside the CDC named Dr. William Thompson, who was going to come forward and say that they were committing scientific fraud in vaccine safety studies, specifically the MMR autism study. I made a documentary ultimately about that because, as many of you are aware, I pitched it to my executive producers. I know who you work for. I work for CBS. And they said, we're never going to go near that story. There is no way we're going to do a story that calls out the CDC and says that they're committing fraud of any kind, because we got to go and report on the latest flu epidemic, and they would let us behind the scenes, and we would make it into television, and we're not going to hurt that relationship. We're also not going to go after a product made by Merck, who's just one of the pharmaceutical companies that fund the show and fund most of television. As you well know, if you work in television, somewhere between 50 to 70% of advertising is coming from the pharmaceutical industry, which is
Okay. This one I did fact check. And in fact, pharma is even higher. Across all the healthcare industry in general, if you look at digital ad spending, pharma accounts for 90%. But that has not stopped newspapers from publishing negative coverage. So in fact, if you look at the pre-lockdown period, the main topics when it comes to pharma was opioids, 40%, and high drug prices, 30%. Not the topics that pharma would have wanted to see in the newspapers where they're buying ads. But they still continue to buy ads. 90% of the total ad spending.
why you're mandated to write the things that you write and told the things that you cannot write. So sometimes it takes courage to step out and do investigation beyond that. Let me show you very quickly where that investigation should start for all of you. These are vaccine inserts. I had my COO, Bridget Rasmussen, go by a doctor and say,
so this is when he pulls out the package inserts that he incorrectly calls vaccine inserts.
we just like to see some vaccine inserts. Twinrix, I'm going to read them off, Haverix, Shingrix. Well, did experts say when Del Bigtree or Robert Kennedy Jr. says that there's been no placebo-based trials to establish safety prior to licensure, I would probably put money that none of you reporters have ever grabbed one of these and read it. Or if you did, then how did you write the experts say that that is misinformation? Because it's written in every single insert that shows up with every single vaccine that you've taken and that our children have been given. There's a very interesting conversation that happened during the hearings between Rand Paul and Senator Cassidy. Senator Cassidy brought up the importance of the hepatitis B vaccine, telling an anecdotal story about a young girl that he cared a lot about who was having liver failure. A tragic story, absolutely. But for Robert Kennedy Jr. and I and so many people in this room and thousands and thousands and thousands of parents, there is a story of a regression into autism or of seizures or of encephalitis, swelling of the brain in their babies after a vaccination, that apparently we're not supposed to care about that story.
Okay. Well, obviously nobody's saying that we should not care about sick children. But as we just looked at, the autism societies, the patient advocacy groups, they don't care anymore about the vaccine link.
That Bobby Kennedy can't tell that story. That child doesn't matter. In the conversation, Rand Paul pointed out that hepatitis B is a sexually transmitted disease. The vaccine was developed for prostitutes and people that were having extreme sexual relations or heroin addicts. And he said, I think that a parent should have a right to decide whether they vaccinate their one-day-old baby, which is when this vaccine is delivered all across America. You should be able to opt out of a hepatitis B vaccine, since it is unlikely in the near future for a day-one-old baby they will be having extreme sexual intercourse or sharing heroin needles. So what is the purpose? And of course, Senator Cassidy, I'm very glad that he had as many deep conversations as he did with Robert Kennedy Jr., but right before our eyes we saw what conversation can happen when reasonable people start talking about an issue that they've never been allowed to talk about before. Senator Cassidy, in front of television all across the world, had to state, you know what? You're making a good point. It is a sexually transmitted disease, but in mothers that are hepatitis B positive, that vaccine is going to save that infant. Senator Rand Paul pointed out, rightfully so, that every mother in America is tested prior to delivering a baby. We know whether they are hepatitis B positive or not. So why is every woman being forced to give their baby a hepatitis B vaccine when we already know their status? And right there, in front of the world, Senator Cassidy said, you know what? Okay, I don't think a mother should be forced to take it if she's hepatitis B negative. We just watched the first transformation of a medical doctor in an important conversation, changing his mind based on the available science. That, was he unaware of it prior to that conversation? I don't know. Or had he forgotten about that? I don't know. But what we did see is a mind being changed. And so when people say, is Robert Kennedy Jr. going to take the vaccine away? I would say Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to begin a conversation of transparency, of talking about the actual science that is written in every one of these lists, pages and pages. Say you're doing your job. Who?
Okay. So, a lot to unpack here. First, that's not how this conversation went down between Senator Cassidy, who's a gastroenterologist, who has been in the Senate for 10 years. I'm not sure if he's been seeing patients, certainly not full-time in these last 10 years. And Rand Paul, an ophthalmologist, who has been in the Senate for 14 years. And it was not a conversation, actually. Rand Paul said something like, why do we give infants Hep B shots? Those are for drug addicts. Kind of echoing what Del Bigtree said. So Cassidy then jumped in, even though it was not his turn, and said, for the record, there is a reason. It's maternal transmission. And he did mention the grave consequences of an infant becoming Hep B positive. Then, in that case scenario, they have a 90% chance of becoming chronically infected, leading to premature death from cirrhosis and hepatocellular carcinoma decades later. But as Del Bigtree said, Senator Cassidy then admitted that if the mothers have B negative, or he stated that if the mothers have been negative, there's less need for a vaccine. So a few important facts that Senator Cassidy did not mention. Number one, the WHO, not just the CDC and the various university guidelines, etc., the World Health Organization recommends Hep B vaccination for all infants, all newborns. And here's what they say. Worldwide, over 240 million people are chronically infected with Hep B, which can lead to premature death from liver cirrhosis or cancer. HBV is the second most important known human carcinogen after tobacco. Of course, these 240 million people are not uniformly distributed, and there are more of them in Asia, but certainly in the US as well. However, the WHO goes on to say, HBV infection can be prevented by one of the safest and most effective vaccines available. The hepatitis B vaccine not only protects children and adults from HBV infection, but clinical trials have established that if given within 24 hours after birth and followed by at least 2 subsequent doses, the vaccine is approximately 90% effective at preventing perinatal HBV infection. This means that the vaccine can prevent HBV infection in newborns even after they have been exposed to the virus from their mother. Protecting newborns is important because infection at this point in the life cycle is much more likely to persist as chronic infection and lead to premature death. And this is an important quote from a CDC publication. Hepatitis B virus is transmitted through percutaneous, i.e. puncture through the skin, or mucosal, i.e. direct contact with mucous membranes, exposure to infectious fluids, blood, or body fluids. HBV is highly infectious, can be transmitted in the absence of visible blood, and remains viable on environmental surfaces for at least 7 days. And in fact, vertical transmission in newborns from the mother to child is just one of the ways of transmission. Another one is horizontal transmission from breaks in skin, such as scratches, dermatitis, likely through infected close contacts in early childhood. So when that newborn goes home and is greeted by family and friends, those family and friends are not tested for hepatitis B, only the mother is. And the other statistic is that up to 25% of adults who acquired their HBV infection during childhood will die from HBV-related liver cancer or cirrhosis, meaning prematurely. And here's what the Johns Hopkins guideline says. After the introduction of the hepatitis B vaccine in the United States in 1982, a greater than 90% reduction in new infections was observed. However, approximately 1,000 new cases of perinatal hepatitis B infection are still identified annually in the United States. So we should be doing more newborn vaccinations, not less. And newborn, by the way, is also called birthday vaccinations, BD. And why so this is so important, as was mentioned, for a child who is infected with HBV, the younger they are, the more likely that this infection will become chronic and lead to cirrhosis and hepatocellular carcinoma. And the highest likelihood is right at the time of birth, almost 100%. Okay, now what about safety? There was a study of neonatal hepatitis B vaccine administration where they looked at about 3,000 infants who were vaccinated and 2,500 who were not. And they saw no significant differences in fever, allergic reactions, seizures, or other neurologic events. In the first 21 days of life. The study found no evidence that hepatitis B vaccination is associated with an increase in the number of febrile episodes, sepsis evaluations, or allergic or neurologic events. In fact, there's a recent study in Nature Communications from a couple of years ago that talks about this effort by the World Health Organization to eliminate hepatitis B worldwide by 2030. And we're running out of time to do that. Because in many countries, particularly this first dose, the birthday dose to a newborn, is logistically very challenging to do, and they remain behind. So this paper models what would happen if we try to get all these countries to hurry up and to get the hepatitis B birth dose vaccination, those day one vaccinations, to 90%. By 2030. And they're calculating how many deaths could be prevented through this. And the greatest benefit is in Africa, where the rates of vaccination are very low and the rates of hepatitis B are high. And just this figure, I thought, was really striking. If the countries catch up quickly and increase their rate of day one vaccinations, by 2030, the impact on the averted deaths will be enormous and will go on for decades, which makes sense because these deaths are prevented decades after vaccination. And so the conclusion here is that birthday vaccination averts deaths. And the question that I would ask is, do we want to become like Africa? If the rates of vaccination drop and the rates of hepatitis B transmission increase. So what does this mean? What does this point mean, that these points that Del Bigtree made? Senator Paul said hepatitis B birth dose vaccination should be stopped. So my conclusion is he doesn't know what he's talking about. It was just a spur of the moment comment. Senator Cassidy got a little closer. He said, well, there are HBV positive women, so we have to give it to those infants. But somehow he didn't remember the other reasons for giving it. So he thought that for hepatitis B negative women, it's okay to skip it. Anyway, is this the right forum to have this discussion in the middle of a Senate hearing by two unprepared senators who stopped being doctors more than 10 years ago? And then Del Bigtree picks this up, and instead of correcting, he latches on to this and he says, we just watched the first transformation of a medical doctor and an important conversation changing his mind based on available science. Well, how scary is that? And by the way, notice how he is speaking on behalf of RFK Jr. He says, well, Mr. Kennedy is going to do this and he's going to do that. Again, illustrating that they are together. They're tied at the hip. Imagine, I mean, this organization is, I don't know, what is it, a non-profit or for-profit, whatever it is, non-government, outside of the government. I cannot imagine any other organization in the US or probably anywhere in the world that is outside of the government that ventures to opine on what the corresponding government official might do in the future. How is that possible? The only way that's possible is if this non-government organization is essentially an extension of that person's reach. So that's one reason this is scary. Another reason is that you might say, okay, well, I don't know who this Del Bigtree is. He's talking, saying wrong things medically. He's not a doctor. That's okay. The experts will correct him. The experts will come out and will set the record straight. But remember how Senator Ron Johnson talked in September about corruption and capture of government agencies, media, medical journals, and the medical establishment by large corporate interests? And RFK Jr. says the same thing. And so, by the way, do Bhattacharya and Makari. So there will not be any experts that will be able to correct this, because the trust in experts has been fundamentally undermined. It has taken me some time to wrap my head around this unique and unprecedented point in history that we find ourselves in. And that's also why I go back to this idea of the revolt against science, medicine, and the media that will cost lives, that will literally kill people. And hence the MAHA Kills campaign. So then after this, what I might call a lethal medical advice, Bigtree then proceeds to literally yell at the press that is in the room. New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, CBS, New Yorker, Politico, Access. Those are just the ones that I knew about. Let's watch and listen.
Are you working for? We are supposed to be the fourth branch of government, the fourth estate. We are supposed to challenge these things and say, for how many years will we let these injuries happen before someone decides to make a better product or do a study and figure out, is there a test we can do to see if you're vulnerable to these injuries? We've never studied who these injuries are happening to.
Okay. I'm not sure which injuries he's referring to, but in principle, predictive markers of safety is an active area of research, or was until they started gutting the NIH.
Sure, go ask the experts, just like Tony Fauci, who told you social distancing was science and questioning him was questioning science itself.
Yeah, you see the revolt here against science and medicine with this message? Don't trust the experts. Don't trust the establishment. undermining the establishment?
Just like the vaccine stops transmission, which every single one of you wrote, I don't know how many of you have apologized for getting wrong. But on the high wire one day before anyone, the show that I do online, before anyone received a COVID vaccine, I read the emergency use authorization by the FDA. And it said very clearly, this study could not prove whether or not this vaccine can stop transmission. So what were you writing about? Where was your science, and exactly how do you call the people that got it right the spreaders of misinformation? You have been the spreaders of misinformation. You have gotten it wrong. And America is still waiting for an apology.
Yes.
Let me get back to hepatitis B. Not only is hepatitis B a
The stunned media representatives are keeping their heads down, while the MAHA team is applauding and cheering. And this is not just some person, unknown person. This is someone who was just in the Oval Office that morning. He's speaking with full endorsement of RFK Jr. and Trump. And I just want to show, I don't know exactly that whole story of transmission versus no transmission. Did someone talk that the vaccines stop transmission, and then it turned out that they don't? I have not looked into that yet. But I just want to show the famous Kaplan-Meier plot from the Pfizer New England Journal paper that saved the world. And transmission is not really the point. The point is that the vaccinated people are over 90% protected from infection. That's the point. And I have worked for many years in oncology. I have never seen results like this in oncology. So apology for what? And then he goes back to
sexually transmitted disease or shared by heroin users, so there's no reason a day one old baby should have to get it. Let me show you, I got it blown up for myself so I could actually read it. You can go to
And this time he even forgot about the perinatal transmission. Just said no reason, period.
FDA approved vaccines. Just Google it, and every single vaccine in our program pops up. This is how easy your investigation can begin, if you decide to be brave enough to do the investigation. And then click on whatever vaccine on the childhood schedule you're curious about, and then open up the vaccine insert. 6.1, every single time, this is how this works, at 6.1, the clinical trial experience is written down. This is what they're telling you they did to prove the safety of a vaccine.
So this is scary. Our healthcare policy said someone who's figuring out how to search for package inserts on Google, and he doesn't even know what they're called. He calls them vaccine inserts.
There's only one way to prove safety, by the way. You have to have a safety baseline. In high school, you should have learned about the double-blind placebo trial. You have to have one group getting the product and one group getting a placebo that doesn't affect the human body in any way. And then we had them both, we tracked them, usually for years when it comes to cancer drugs. And it doesn't matter if you're dying of cancer, we're not going to let you trial that drug until we've proven it's safe. Years we followed it. How long did we follow the hepatitis B vaccine trial group? It says right here, 6.1 clinical trials. In 3 clinical studies, 434 doses of Recombavax HB, you can look that one up, 5 micrograms were administered to 147 healthy infants and children up to 10 years of age, who were monitored for 5 days after each dose. Injection site reactions and systemic adverse reaction were reported 5 days.
Well, I'm not a vaccine expert. I have never run a vaccine study. And he's right here for Recombavax. It does say 5 days. But this vaccine was approved so long ago in the 1980s that I cannot find the review summary from the FDA or the clinical trial protocols. But I found one from a more recently approved vaccine, Heplisav, and this is the FDA clinical review summary. And in the safety conclusions, it does talk about the integrated summary of safety, ISS. And it does talk about the 1 year follow-up in 2 pivotal studies that monitor serious adverse events and adverse events of special interest for 1 year. And interesting, that vaccine, it was approved in 2017. Wasn't so easy for it to get approved. In fact, the FDA issued a complete response letter, meaning they declined the approval. And the sponsor then had to obtain additional data and resubmit. So in this case, doesn't quite fit with this idea that the FDA is corrupt and paid by pharma, and all they do is push unsafe medicines to patients.
A 5-day safety trial with no placebo group. Look it up, it's there. Not misinformation, written by the drug manufacturer. I could do this with every single vaccine. Because of Donald Trump, we had a meeting at the NIH that I went to with Robert Kennedy Jr., one of his first presidents. And we said, why in all of these can we not find a single placebo trial with any of the childhood vaccines? Are you not doing placebo trials and establishing safety the way every other drug is established? Or are you just not publishing those trials? There was silence in the room, and finally Tony Fauci admitted, we don't do placebo trials on vaccines because it would be unethical. Unethical. For a vaccine like Gardasil, the first time they were going to try and deal with cancer, the vaccine, they had a belief that it was safe because they never did a proper placebo trial to test if it was.
Here I'm confused. I would assume that because RFK Jr. spent many years suing Merck about Gardasil, that he and Victory would know that there were placebo trials of Gardasil. Here's one of 12,000 patients. So that confused me. And then, in terms of this idea, why can't we? Why do we? Why don't we do placebo trials for vaccines in perpetuity? Well, there are two things. First of all, if you look in PubMed, there are about 6,000 randomized controlled trials of vaccines. And if you add the word placebo, a keyword placebo, there are 443. So there are clearly a lot of placebo-controlled vaccine trials that have been done over the years. But if there are small modifications made to the vaccine over the years or even decades, does it make sense to repeat a randomized placebo-controlled trial every time? You may know friends or family members who are taking generic medications, and the common complaint is that, this was green before and now it's purple, the same medication, what happened? And the pharmacist explains, well, because we switched generic manufacturers. So if you're taking a generic Lipitor, it maybe one generic manufacturer was a different color than another. So are we going to do placebo-controlled trials with each one of those when there are already plenty of lipid-lowering agents out there? Who's going to sign up for that study? So in this case, it's no longer required. It's no longer possible. So you just need to demonstrate bioequivalence, that the generic behaves in a similar way to the brand. And it's really the same story with vaccines.
We just had an RSV vaccine just a couple of months ago, by the way, that finally had a saline placebo trial, and they stopped it because babies were getting sick, and it was clear that the vaccine was hurting children. Is that just because it was the first placebo-based trial we'd ever seen in a childhood vaccine? And let me say this unequivocally, if I ever see you write in your paper that the experts say a placebo trial was done, then you better print it in that article, and I've said that to all of you. And send it to me and Robert Kennedy Jr., because at the NIH, Tony Fauci and Francis Collins admitted we don't do them. So what does that mean?
See how he's talking to the media. This is a revolt against the media. I'm the boss now. There's a new sheriff in town. And if you ever say something, you better bring it to me in RFK Jr. I have never heard anyone speak to the media like this since I left Russia.
What does that mean for the safety of our babies and our children? A day-one-old baby is getting a product that we only cared to test for 5 days. Does a healthy child not deserve better than that? Because a cancer patient does. Our grandparents get products that are against placebo for years. Why are our babies not mattering? By the way, America has the highest rate of first-day baby deaths in the industrialized world, reported by CBS. Is that caused by hepatitis B? I don't know. Is it caused by bad hospitals? Are we a third world nation? Do we not know how to treat a day-one-old baby? Robert Kennedy Jr. is about to start having investigations in these horrible stats. And for anyone that says there's no...
Again, he's speaking and opining on what our Secretary of Health and Human Services is going to do. as though he has special privileges. He has some insider information into what our senior administration official is going to do in the future. That is quite an unprecedented situation for a non-government organization.
No such thing as vaccine injury. That's curious, because written right here in 6.2, since you only did a 5-day safety trial, we are left with the post-marketing surveillance. I'd point out nervous system disorders for hepatitis B given to a day 1-old baby. Guillain-Barré syndrome, that's paralysis. And by the way, prior to a polio vaccine, that would have been called poliomyelitis. Paralysis still exists. It's still happening. Now it's a side effect of vaccination. Multiple sclerosis, exacerbation of multiple sclerosis, myelitis, including transverse myelitis, all paralytic diseases written here as being caused by a vaccination. Now you could say how many, but is that the only question? Do we actually live in a country where we're going to allow this to happen to anybody, especially a day 1-old baby? Let me continue. Seizures, febrile seizures, peripheral neuropathy, Bell's palsy, radiculopathy, herpes zoster, migraine, muscle weakness, hyperthesia, and encephalitis, brain swelling. Open up every one of these vaccines in a childhood schedule, and you will find encephalitis, a brain swelling event. Is it that shocking, really? Since the vaccine is designed to cause an inflammatory event to get your immune system to kick into gear. That's why they put neurotoxins like aluminum in the vaccine, so it will incite your immune system to swell your body. And if you're unfortunate enough that that swelling happens in your brain, now you're at risk of the symptoms and side effects of a brain swelling event, which, yes, can be autism.
So we'll stop here for part
By
one.
billionaires. The Trump administration.
What we saw in this last portion is fear-mongering that will result in dramatic drops in vaccination rates and deaths. Again, MAHA kills. So in conclusion, from part one, as I mentioned throughout, number one, we see here a revolt against science, medicine, and the media. Number two, the medical establishment has been delegitimized. Number three, people with a known history of manufacturing evidence, and I refer you now to my white paper, are now in charge. And number four, people in charge lack basic expertise, searching things on Google, misunderstanding basic medical concepts. I shared a short video with all of you that has the highlights from this press conference, about 7 minutes, and I heard from some of my friends and colleagues, they are shocked, they're in disbelief. I have spoken to infectious disease experts, public health experts, and three things are clear. Number one, the community, the medical community in the US is shell-shocked and afraid to speak up. Number two, there's no organized, centralized effort to develop any kind of a counter strategy or messaging. And number three, there's increasing fatalistic acceptance of the fact that many people will have to die before there can be any change or undoing of the damage. But I'm an optimist, so I'll end on a somewhat optimistic note. And I would ask three things. I refuse to believe that this is a done deal and that people will have to die. and that's the only way out of this. So I ask for three things. Number one, please spread this podcast far and wide, forward, like, repost. Feel free to get involved. You can do so confidentially. Just reach out. And if you know anyone who is strategizing about a response, like I am, please send them my way. This has been the first episode of The Language of Evidence. I will release part 2 next week. And then the following week, we have a special guest. Until next time, this is Alex Morozov and The Language of Evidence.